Hello, friends. Happy Monday. How are you doing? I hope you are doing wonderful and I hope you had a great week. I know I did. I did a lot of motorcycle riding, homework, and the last couple Fridays I have hosted game night at my house, and it has been a blast. This last Friday I had like 14 people over, and I made a lot of food, and some of my friends brought food as well, and there were a lot of compliments to me, the chef, and we just all had such a wonderful time. A lot of people that came, it was their first time being over to our house since we bought it last November. So it was just super excited to see their expressions and to see how proud they were of me and my husband. So yeah, I take that to heart. And for those that are listening, that are also friends that were there, thank you guys. I appreciate you. We had so much fun, and hopefully we'll get to host more in the future. It just really depends on my husband's work schedule. Other than that, we voted a while ago on different topics to discuss. And one of them that I got a lot of responses from was mob mentality. So I figured since it's September, it's starting to get colder out, and it's almost October in a couple weeks. Also, it's pumpkin spice season, which is my favorite season. I figured we would start this mob mentality series, starting with the Salem Witch Trials. Ooh. Now, the mob mentality series, I don't know if I'm going to do it every week or like every other week, but it'll be a series on something that's based on mob mentality. So for this week, it'll be Salem Witch Trials. In the future, it could be about cults, the social media, politics, other things. So we'll see where that goes. And tell me what you think. What is something that you think is mob mentality? Now, one of my good friends on Facebook, we're a part of a few groups together. Whenever I shared the poll about which subject we should go over, she voted for mob mentality / mass hysteria, and she suggested a few things which I think I'm going to look into in the future as well. And some of these I don't think I've heard of, or one of these I've never heard of. She said Black Friday, the dancing plague / curse, which I don't think I've ever heard of that one, so that'll be interesting. And then she said, of course, the 2020 toilet paper crisis. So, with the Salem Witch Trials, there are some very interesting things that I discovered digging into this. And there's a very, very dark part of my own history that coincides. So, listen up. I am your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you're listening to What the Psychology. Okie dokie. The Salem Witch Trials. So now, before we start, I don't want to downplay the Salem Witch Trials when saying this, but the idea of witch trials was around long before this came to the Americas, or the early Americas at the time. And it happened a lot in England, Scotland, Ireland, pretty much throughout Europe. And they were a lot more savage in the way that they tortured and killed people. At least killed people. It's kind of unknown, or I couldn't find a lot about the torturing techniques of the Salem Witch Trials. But in the other witch trials in England, or I should say in Europe, they were very, very cruel from the accounts that I was reading. So a lot of these were burned to death, beheaded, strangled, executed with a tomahawk, decapitated and burned, disemboweled and fed to pigs, public execution by beheading, and public execution by firing squad. These occurred all the way from like the 1400s to like the 1800s. So most commonly known as the Salem Witch Trials, and then I would just say like the Witch Trials of Europe because there's a lot of them. There was one called the Pendle Witches Hunt, which is one of the most famous witch trials in English history. which I have some English ancestry, so I wonder if any of them are connected to that one too. And then there were just other witch trials or people that they claimed that were a witch and that were executed. When it comes to the possible causes of the trials, there are a lot of questions that come into mind. And the biggest thing is why? Like, why? And in particularly the Salem Witch Trials, they were two young girls who pretty much started the whole thing, which we'll get into. So we want to know what caused the afflicted girls' initial symptoms and what caused the witch trials to escalate the way that they did. Now, what we do know is that witches and the devil were a very real concern to the Salem villagers, as they were to many colonists of that time. Now, we do know that Salem was experiencing a number of hardships at the time. They had a lot of disease epidemics, war, and political strife. And honestly, it wasn't so hard to convince some of the villagers that witches were to blame for their misfortune. And once that idea took hold in the colony, things seemed to get quickly out of hand. So in Salem Village in February 1692, Betty Paris, she was 9 years old, and her cousin Abigail Williams, who was 11, who was the daughter and the niece, respectively, of Reverend Samuel Paris. And they began to have fits described as, quote-unquote, beyond the power of epileptic fits. These girls, they would scream, they threw things about the room, they uttered strange sounds, they crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions, according to the eyewitness account of Reverend Deodat Lawson, who was a former minister in Salem Village. These girls, they complained of being pinched and pricked with pins, and a doctor historically assumed to be William Griggs couldn't find no physical evidence of these claims. Now, this does play into one of the theories that we're going to get into later, so just keep that into mind. And we'll probably go back over this too. There were other young women in the village that began to exhibit the same behaviors. And when Lawson preached as a guest in the Salem Village meeting house, he was interrupted several times by the outbursts of the afflicted. So two of the other girls that were afflicted was 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard. The first three people that were accused and arrested for allegedly afflicting all four of these girls was Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Tituba was the first one to be accused and arrested. A lot of historians, they believe that the accusation by Ann Putnam Jr. suggests that a family feud may have been a major cause of the witch trials. Now, this is because at the time there was a vicious rivalry between the Putnam and Porter families, and it deeply polarized the people of Salem. Citizens, they would have heated debates, which escalated into full-fledged fighting based solely on their opinion of the feud. It's kind of like our politics of today. Oh, you're this, and I'm the opposite. Well, now I hate you just because you're not affiliated with my political belief. Tabuta, she was South American Indian and from the West Indies. She likely became a target because, one, she was ethnically different from most of the other villagers, and she was accused of attracting girls like Abigail and Betty with stories about enchantment. These were tales about sexual encounters with demons, swaying the minds of men, fortune-telling, and they were said to stimulate the imagination of the girls and made Tabuta an obvious target of accusations. Another accused, Sarah Good, she was a destitute woman accused of witchcraft because of her reputation. At her trial, she was accused of rejecting Puritan ideals of self-control and discipline when she chose to torment and scorn children instead of leading them towards the path of salvation. The last one, Sarah Osborne, she rarely attended church meetings, and she was accused of witchcraft because the Puritans believed that Osborne had her own self-interest in mind following her remarriage to an indentured servant, and the citizens of the town disapproved of her trying to control her son's inheritance from her previous marriage. It seemed like the town was very involved in other people's private business and how they handled things, and it's like, just because you did something that they did not agree with, you must be a witch. And so, each of these women, they had some things in common. They were all kind of outcasts. They exhibited many of the character traits that were typical of the quote-unquote usual suspect for witchcraft accusations. And unfortunately, they were left to defend themselves. They were brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft. They were interrogated for several days and then sent to jail. And a lot of that would do a lot to your mind. Being manipulated, being tortured, and then put into jail for not really doing anything quote-unquote wrong. All of this happened starting March 1st, 1692. So now this turned into a spiral effect of more and more people being accused and more people naming other people just to stop whatever torture was going on with them. So a few others that were accused of witchcraft: Martha Corey, Child, Dorothy Good, and Rebecca Nurse in Salem Witch, and Rachel Clinton in nearby Ipswich. Martha Corey, she expressed skepticism about the credibility of the girls' accusations, and so she'd drawn attention to herself. So pretty much she said, these are little girls, yeah, they may be acting out, but what else can we do to try to verify what is going on with them? Do we really know if it's witchcraft? And just because of saying that, or something similar to that, it put her on the radar of, oh, maybe she's a witch, maybe she's one of them. So the charges against her and Rebecca Nurse, they deeply troubled the community because Martha Corey was a full covenanted member of the church in Salem Village, and Rebecca Nurse was in the church in Salem town. Now, if such upstanding people could be witches, then the townspeople thought that anybody could be a witch, and church membership was no longer protection from accusations. Dorothy Good, she was the daughter of Sarah Good, who we know who was earlier executed. She was only 4 years old, but was not exempted from being questioned and tortured by the magistrate. And her questions were constructed as a confession that implicated her mother. And you have to think of a mind of a 4-year-old. Like, for instance, at the age of 5, that's when they actually get a concept on biological sex. Like, oh, I'm a girl. Oh, he's a boy. That kind of thing. So imagine 4, they don't even have the basic concepts of life and how easily it would be to manipulate them. They don't even have the capacity to understand the consequences of their actions. And who knows what they put that poor girl through to get that confession out of her. Now, it says that she was just questioned, so maybe she wasn't tortured. But those questions, they were constructed in a way that had her confess that she was part of something and also her mother. Now, for those of you that have children or have nieces, nephews, cousins that are really young, you know that talking to a 4-year-old, even a 5 or 6-year-old, their imagination is so broad, and the things that they come up with or the things that they say can be crazy sometimes and so unrealistic. And it's so easy to play along with a 4-year-old and kind of be a kid yourself and using your own imagination. So just imagine how easy it would have been for them to have her implicate her mother. In Ipswich, Rachel Clinton was arrested for witchcraft at the end of March on independent charges unrelated to the afflictions of the girls in Salem Village. So now this would take a turning point into the investigations to where people could be implicated on anything now. Like, it wasn't just those initial 2 to 4 girls that were having fits and whatnot. Now you can just be accused of things unrelated to that. So this thing just grew and grew and grew. I have a list of names of the people that were executed during the Salem Witch Trials, and I want to go through each person. That way we can really acknowledge the realness of this taking place. And then I'm going to dive into a little bit more history of my own family. Wonder what that could be about. Really apologize if I do mispronounce any of these names. You guys already know that I can't pronounce. The first person that was recorded to have been executed for witchcraft in the American colonies was Halsey Young. They were born in 1600 and they died in 1647, and they were hanged in Connecticut colony. You have to remember, the Salem Witch Trials did not just take place in Massachusetts. It's also considered to take place in Connecticut and in Ipswich, which was a town over, which I think was still in the same county, but there are also people from Connecticut. The first person was Halsey Young, and they were the first person recorded to have been executed for witchcraft in the American colony, and they were hanged. And this happened in Connecticut colony. Now, the first person to be executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts Bay Colony was hanged, and was Margaret Jones. One of the first to be convicted in the Salem Witch Trials was Sarah Good in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first person to be tried and executed during the Salem Witch Trials was Bridget Bishop. She was hanged in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The fourth person that was executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts Bay Colony was Anne Tibbins, and she was actually hanged on Boston Common. Hanged during the witch trials was Rebecca Nurse, who we've heard that name before. A congregational pastor was executed as part of the Salem Witch Trials, named George Burroughs in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Hanged during the Salem Witch Trials was Martha Carrier. Her children had claimed that she was a witch while undergoing torture. She was hanged in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Giles Corey, he is a very famous figure for his method of dying in the Salem Witch Trials. He was actually crushed to death. We don't know if they purposely were trying to kill him, but they were purposely torturing him to try to get him to confess, or to implicate his wife, who was also hung in the witch trials. And he was pretty much crushed to death for refusing to plea during the trials. And literally, this guy, he is so tough. So they put one rock, or it's not even a rock, it's like a big rock. And they put another big rock, and so on and so forth. They pretty much put a bunch of boulders on you to crush you. And his famous last words were, "More weight, please." This dude was bad. Like he would not give in, and good on him. Sad that he had to be crushed to death for that. And he is one of the few that wasn't hung during the Salem Witch Trials. Martha Corey, his wife, she was hanged. Mary Eastay was hanged. Goodwife Greensmith was hanged in Connecticut Colony at Hartford, Connecticut. Elizabeth Howell was hanged. George Jacobs was hanged. Mary Johnson hanged. Miss Kendall was hanged at Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mary Johnson was hanged at Hartford, Connecticut. Goodwife Nat was hanged at Fairfield, Connecticut, but was from Massachusetts Bay Colony. Alice Lake was the wife of Henry Lake and was hanged in Massachusetts. Alice Parker, who was hanged. Mary Parker, who was hanged. John Proctor, who was hanged. Pudetor was hanged. Wilmot Red, hanged. Margaret Scott was hanged. Sarah Wilds, hanged. John Willard, hanged. And Anne Glover was last hanged for witchcraft in Boston. Now, there's one other person who died in the Salem Witch Trials, but I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. And then there was another one who was convicted but wasn't hanged. And we're going to talk about her case as well. Now, as you guys know, one of my hobbies is ancestry, and I have discovered a lot about my family through genealogy, and I found this out a while ago, but I figured since I'm doing this episode about people of that time, I should talk about my ancestors who lived there at that time. Now, I am going to talk about some good, some bad. So I'm going to pull up my family tree, and because I have some family members listening, this way you can know a little bit about your history as well. I'm going to talk about the Ring family. R-I-N-G, like when you ring a bell, if you get into the boxing ring, that name. The Ring family is on my mother's side of the family. And so I'm going to just say last names because it will be important for those of my family that are listening in to understand how to trace this back. So it took me a lot of time to construct this and follow my tree, so that way it's understanding. So I figured the easiest thing to do is just to list the surnames of what order it goes down to, starting with my grandma and then up the line to the Ring family. So for those that are listening that are family, if you have family trees or you trace them, or if you're interested in getting a printout of more specific information for this, I can always lend that to you. But here's the line that it goes to. So there's Brayfield, then Daly, DeWitt, Davis, Jewell, then Ring. So the first ancestor I'm going to talk about is Robert Ring Sr. He is my 11th great-grandfather, so that pretty much describes how far back this goes. He was born in 1614 in Marlborough, Wiltshire, England, and his mother Elizabeth was 25. As far as I know, I can't find anything on his father. Now, Robert came to United States as an indentured servant since he was unable to afford the journey with his limited funds. He was a barrel maker by trade and settled on an island since named Rings Island. Over time and due to changes in topography, Rings Island is now high and dry and a part of the mainland. It's a section of the city of Salisbury. Now, Rings Island, I actually have a picture of it and I'll probably post this. And it says, on March 26, 1642, the town of Salisbury granted 2 acres of upland to Robert Ring upon the island to be used for fishing, which becomes one of his occupations and his trades when he's in the United States. So Robert Ring, when he did die, he had gained respect as one of the original founders of Salisbury, and for the time, he was a rather wealthy man. And that's quite something for a man who journeyed to an unknown destination. He was a humble servant, and his potential was not fully realized. Some more information about Robert Ring, or I'm going to say Robert Ring Sr. So he immigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638, sailing on the ship called Confidence from Southampton on April 24th. So this voyage of the Confidence carried a large group of friends, relatives, and neighbors from Wiltshire, England. They were part of the Great Migration from an England in crisis to a rapid populating New England frontier. The ship's list records Robert Ring as a servant of John Sanders, but his description is entirely misleading if servant is taken at its usual meaning. So he was 24, unmarried, and he was a younger son of his family with little prospect of an English inheritance. John Sanders was his ostensible master, quote-unquote, but he was only a year older and also unmarried. And they were more likely friends and maybe relatives. They were both from the same part of Wiltshire, England. Sanders was, however, somewhat better connected with the access to more investment capital for this adventure. He was one of the 12 grantees to land in the area which would later become Salisbury, Massachusetts. So Ring was just a step below him on the social scale, but he probably did not lack the 5 or 6 pounds required to pay his own passage to come to America. But with Sanders sponsoring Ring as a servant, Sanders became more eligible for additional head right, quote-unquote, which granted lands in America, which were based on the following laws that were passed by Massachusetts authorities in 1629. For such as transport servants, land shall be allotted for each servant, 50 acres to the master, which land the master is to dispose at his discretion. So it's not really hard to imagine that the deal with Ring and Sanders must have struck, because they both get something out of it. If Ring agrees to travel as Sanders' servant, then Sanders receives 50 acres of land, at which he could give some of that to Ring. It wasn't really a master-servant relationship. More than that, it was probably fictitious and out of convenience for both of them. They were both getting something out of it. Ring got free passage to America with his friends and neighbors where he could start a brand new life. And he will not need the capital, the money, to start living there. Sanders also got the economic benefit apart from any labor obligation he may have negotiated with Ring. As an investor and land grantee, it was probably advantageous for the young Sanders to present a more mature image of himself. Unmarried man with various servants en route to America. However, that image was very deceptive because Robert wasn't his servant, and although he was not married, on his route to America, he claimed to be married. But the woman named on the ship that was listed as his wife wasn't his wife. It was actually his sister. So as a guise to get them all three to be able to come here, he said, oh, my sister's my wife and Robert Ring is my servant. So shortly after actually arriving in Massachusetts in the early summer of 1638, this group of Wiltshire immigrants headed for their land grants on the north shore of the Merrimack River, and it's an area briefly called Colchester, and then it was renamed Salisbury. In May of 1639, 6 of the original 12 grantees of Salisbury met and agreed that each settler would receive 2 meadow lots, 1 near the village and 1 farther off, as well as upland planting lots, all to be distributed on the basis of wealth. Those with more money received larger lots. Now, my ancestor, Robert Ring, he received land in the 1st Division of Salisbury. And this was not a single event. It was a series of town meetings and arguments, agreements over the course of many months in 1639 and 1640. This is when grants of land were made and recorded. His house lot in the village was in the southeast, almost facing the meeting house on the main street, which entered from Hampton in the north and exited via a ferry over the Merrimack River to Newburyport. He was declared a freeman by the Quarterly Court on October 9, 1640, upon evidence of church membership and the taking of a loyalty oath. Now, this was very significant because now he could vote, he was eligible to hold public office, and was a full member of the Puritan community. Now, when I say freeman, you have to remember back then, they kept records of masters and slaves, and if you're a freeman, if you were enslaved, that's the language that was used back then, and unfortunately, that's how they labeled people. So he was declared a freeman, he could vote, run for office, be an official and full member of the Puritan community. So he was a copper, which is a barrel maker, which we talked about, a fisherman, and a farmer. So he was a man of many trades. On March 26, 1642, he received a grant from the town of Salisbury of 2 acres of upland upon the island over against Watts Cellar, which is the opposite of the present town Newburyport, to be employed about fishing for 2 years. So the quote-unquote island, which is actually really a peninsula projecting into the Merrimack River, it is continued to be known as Rings Island even today, which has that sign up that I read earlier. In the early days of the colony, it was used as a site for dry fishing and storing fish products. That's kind of how he made his living there. However, late in 1643, Robert Ring returned to England for unknown reasons. He left his friend and neighbor Robert Pike as his agent in Salisbury. So, he was absent for almost 9 years, and he later explained that that was due to the difficulties caused by the Civil War in England, and that during his stay in England, he actually met and fell in love with a woman named Elizabeth Jarvis, who is my 11th great-grandmother. So she was also born in Marlborough, Wiltshire, England, but about 1618. They had 2 daughters. Their first 2 daughters were actually born in England. Hannah Ring, which was born in 1649, and Elizabeth Ring, born in 1652. Yeah, they had 2 kids while they were in England. His date of return to Massachusetts is not known, but he did travel with his wife, the 2 kids, and probably his teenage niece, Sarah Ring. And from the documents and the digging that I've been able to find have confirmed this. And I'm sorry if I'm giving a lot of history, but it's really important to kind of know the history of this ancestor, and then we're going to get further into his children and my great-great-uncles. So he did serve as a town selectman of Salisbury for 1-year terms in 1655, 1656, 1668, and 1681. He served as a trial juror in the Essex County Quarterly Court held in Salisbury in 1663 and 1668, on the grand jury in 1675 in Salisbury, 1676 in Ipswich, 1685 in Salem, and 1686 again in Ipswich. In 1666, he was chosen, quote-unquote, packer and gauger for Salisbury, probably due to his early training as a barrel maker. A gauger inspected new barrels for volume, while a packer enforced standards for filling barrels with merchandise, which is usually fish. He was doing a lot of things. He was one of the founding fathers of this part in Massachusetts. He was doing all these great things. He was making business. He was elected official in some sort. He was just overall a good citizen. And he was well known and well respected and kind of wealthy for the time. Which is crazy to think he came from nothing. Like, he did not have much when he came to America. He had to be sponsored by his friend. Robert and Elizabeth had 5 other children once they came back to Massachusetts. So they had Martha Ring, Jarvis Ring, John Ring, Joseph Ring, and Robert Jr. Ring. One of those children is, of course, my 10th great-grandfather, which is Robert Ring Jr. But we are actually going to focus on 2 of his brothers. They were both very famous or infamous, as the case may be, for testifying at the Salem Witch Trials. Yep, 2 of my 10th great-grand-uncles did this. They testified. And that's what I want to get into a little bit. Joseph Ring only testified once, and Jarvis Ring and his wife, Hannah Fowler, they both testified twice. The first woman was Susanna Martin. She was executed during the Salem Witch Trials. She was hung in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Before I really get into this, I'm just going to say I don't have much history on Jarvis. However, Joseph Ring, who testified against Susanna, he's got a lot of background. And I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to read some of this. So Joseph Ring, he was possessed by demons. The Puritan minister Cotton Mather would write in a 1693 account justifying the witch trials. The young militiaman, he claimed, was struck dumb by a woman who was present when he met Hardy, a widow named Susanna Martin. In 1692, Ring gave testimony during Martin's trial in Salem that he had been drinking cider with Martin, another woman, and Hardy before a roaring fire. Martin, he said, transferred herself into a pig, and she was hung on July 19, 1692. It may be a modern concept, post-traumatic stress disorder, which I've mentioned before but haven't gotten into full detail yet. It kind of explains Joseph Ring and his strange and fateful claim. So he absorbed a lot of terror of Indian attacks, not just because of being in the military or his militia experience, but his family experience as well. So he participated in a lot of the wars of the early times. He witnessed a lot of attacks by Native Americans, so he greatly feared them. There was a lot of conflict at that time, and so I think a lot of that affected him. And I'm not making excuses for him, because I read a lot about him and what he went through, and it's really sad, his life. And I think a lot of the things that he claimed, it could have just been because of what we call today PTSD. Also, on January 28th, 1704, Indians attacked the Neal garrison, and settlers fought them off with help from soldiers stationed nearby. A 1726 history of the early Indian Wars by Samuel Penhallow said that 9 attackers were killed, and the losses enraged the Indians so much that, quote, that at their return they executed their revenge on Joseph Ring, who was then a captive among them, whom they fastened to a stake and burnt alive, barbarously shouting and rejoicing at his cries. Now, getting into his brother Jarvis, I'm going to read his testimony against Susanna Martin, and then I'm going to read Joseph's testimony. So, Jarvis Ring of Salisbury maketh oath as followeth, that about 7 or 8 years ago he had been several times afflicted in the night time by somebody or something coming upon him when he was in bed, and did sorely afflict by laying upon him, and he could neither move nor speak, but sometimes made a kind of noise that folks did hear him and come up to him, and as soon as anybody came it would be gone. Kind of sounds like sleep paralysis. Okay, so this is his own words, and I'm going to read them. This is from the testimony. This it did for a long time before, and since before, he did never see anybody clearly, but one time in the night it came upon me, as other times, and I did then see the person of Susanna Martin of Amesbury. This deponent did perfectly see her, and she came to this deponent and took him by the hand, and bit him by the finger by force, and then came and lay upon him a while as formerly, and after a while went away. The print of the bite is yet to be seen on the little finger of his right hand, for it was hard to heal, he further saith. That several times he was asleep when it came, but at that time when his finger was bit, he was fairly awake as ever he was, and plainly saw her shape, and felt her tooth as aforesaid. Sworn by Jarvis Ring above said, May the 13th, 1692, before me, Robert Pike, assistant at Salisbury Jurat in Curia. Yep, that's what Jarvis Ring claimed. So, it sounds like he was having sleep paralysis, and then something bit his finger. And he says that he saw Susanna Martin, which is the accused here. Very, very weird. Now, when it came to Joseph Ring, he testified that he was possessed by demons, and this is his testimony. This man has been strangely carried out by demons from one witch meeting to another for nearly 2 years together, and for 1/4 of this time they have made him and keep him dumb, though he is now again able to speak. Therefore was one who, having, as 'tis judged, a design of engaging this Joseph Ring in a snare of devilion, contrived a while to keep this ring 2 shillings in debt unto him. Afterwards this poor man would be vilified with a known shape, and sometimes among them, which would force him away with them unto known places, where he saw meetings, dancing, and after his return they buried him along through the air. He gave demonstrations to the neighbors that he had indeed been transported. When he was brought into the meetings, one of the first things they did unto him was give him a knock on the back, whereupon he was ever as if bound chains, incapable of stirring out of them, till they should release him. He related that there often came to him a man who pretended from a book, whereto he would have him set his hand, promising to him that he should then have even what he would, and preventing him all the delectable things, perform persons and places that he could imagine. But he refusing to subscribe, the benefits would end with dreadful shape, dreams, boils, screeches, which almost scare him out of his wits. Once with the book, there was a pen offered him, and an ink borne with liquor in it, that seemed like blood, but he never touched it. This man did now affirm that he saw the prisoner at several of those hellish rendezvous. Note, this woman was one of the most impudent, ferociously wicked creatures in the world, and she did now throughout her whole trial discover herself to be such as one. Yet, when she was asked what she had to say for herself, her chief plea was that she had led a most virtuous and holy life. So it sounds like Joseph had a lot of hallucinations. and they were just wild and crazy. That's why I kind of think Joseph Ring was suffering from some other type of illness, while Jarvis was just, I don't know. I don't know what Jarvis was thinking, honestly. So now let's talk about Susanna a little bit, because I do want to honor her memory a little bit. Descriptions of Susanna say that she was short, slightly plump, active, and of remarkable personal neatness. She was said to be very outspoken, contemptuous of authority, and defiant in the face of slander, which had followed her for years. So she was a woman back in the times where women were not equal to men, or they were not seen as equal to men. A lot of these things that describe her kind of describe me. Slightly plump, short, active. I'm kind of neat. The Reverend Cotton Mather also said about Susanna that this woman was one of the most impudent, ferocious, wicked creatures of this world. Mr. Merrill, in his History of Amesbury, he described Susanna very differently. The idea of snatching this hard-working, honest woman from her home to be tried for her life by those who never knew her and witnesses who were prejudiced against her is almost too much for belief. She was allowed no counsel, she was her own lawyer, and her answers are remarkable for independence and clearness. She showed herself to be a woman of more than ordinary talent and resolution. And that is probably the statement that I would agree with over what the Reverend said about her. And it's crazy to think that they never even met her. They were just claiming that this creature or whatever looked like her. So on April 30th, 1692, a warrant was issued for Susanna's arrest on a charge of witchcraft, and she was arrested on May 2nd. When she saw Orlando Bagley approaching on the morning of her arrest, little did she dream of his errand. He was actually a personal friend of long standing, and we can but faintly imagine her surprise when he read her warrant. During her preliminary examination that happened the same day, she vigorously answered the charges against her. When the quote-unquote afflicted girls began having fits, she laughed out loud. When the magistrate asked why she laughed, she responded, "Well, I may at such folly." She refused to express any thoughts on what may have ailed the girls, but bluntly stated that she didn't think that they were bewitched. Her further testimony showed that she realized the seriousness of her situation, and she adamantly maintained her innocence. So kind of at first she thought this was just BS and a joke and wasn't really going to go anywhere. And then she realized, oh yeah, this is really serious and things are about to go down. Now, she was in jail for 2.5 months and she suffered a lot of mental anguish while she was in the Salem jail. She underwent the indignity of a physical examination on June 2nd, 1692. So these examinations, they were intended to discover whether she had any physical abnormalities, especially anything that could be used to suckle a familiar or even the devil himself. So Susanna was examined twice during the same day. At neither examination was any abnormality discovered, but at the first her breast appeared to be full, and at the second slack. Doubtless the magistrates found this apparent indication that she had actually suckled even more satisfactory than an abnormal witch's teeth. I do not know what that even means, you guys. She had big breasts, I guess? I don't understand, and I don't understand these examinations either, but... On June 26, 1692, her trial began, and she pleaded not guilty, but in the end she was found guilty and condemned to death. So another interesting tale is on Tuesday, July 19, 1692, Susanna Martin, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Wilde, and Elizabeth Howe. They were taken from their cells, put into a cart, and driven up the rocky road to Gallows Hill. While Rebecca Nurse prayed, Reverend Nicholas Noyes extorted Sarah Good to confess, saying, "You are a witch, and you know you are a witch." She replied, calling him a liar and saying that she was no more a witch than he was a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink. Tradition says that Reverend Noes died of an internal hemorrhage, bleeding profusely from the mouth. That is crazy. The bodies were thrust into a shallow grave in a crevice of felsite, and there is historic evidence that the body of at least one of these women, Rebecca Nurse, was secretly removed and given a Christian burial. And this was the hour and the power of darkness when a son could not say where he had buried his mother. Very sad. In 1711, the General Court granted compensation to many of the victims or their heirs, but Susanna's children made no application to the authorities and they received nothing. And Susanna was not among those who attainder was lifted. So that's Susanna. She seemed like a very brave, intelligent, and independent woman. And at that time, that was not accepted. And that's pretty much the basis of why she was hanged. And people testified that didn't even know her. There was another woman that Jarvis Ring was a part of her testimony to some portion. Him and his wife both were a part of this part, for sure. So him and his wife, Kenneth Fowler, they signed the petition in favor of Miss Mary Bradbury in 1692. It wasn't just them who signed this petition. It was like 100 other people on 22 July 1692. They claimed that she was a, quote, diligent attender upon God's ordinances and that she never had a falling out with any of her neighbors, but was always willing to do for them what lay in her power night and day, though with hazard of her health. So it seems like she was a very good neighbor. She attended church and she never had a falling out with anyone, and she was always willing to do anything for her neighbors. So it doesn't really make sense why she was accused, but so she was accused repeatedly in Salem, and she was supposed to have turned into a blue boar one time. So I guess that was one of their methods of seeing if she was a witch or not, that turn yourself into this. So I'm going to read the deposition for Mary Bradbury. The answer of Mary Bradbury in the charge of witchcraft or familiarity with the devil, I do plead not guilty. I am wholly innocent of any such wickedness through the goodness of God that have kept me hitherto. I am the servant of Jesus Christ, and have given myself up to him as of my only Lord and Savior, and to the diligent attendance upon him and all his holy ordinances, in utter contempt and defiance of the devil, and all his works as horrid and detestable, and accordingly have endeavored to frame my life and conversation according to the rules of his holy word, and in that faith and practice resolve, by the help and assistance of God, to continue to my life's end. For the truth of what I say, as to manner of practices, I humbly refer to myself, to my brethren and neighbors, that know me, and unto the searcher of all heart for the truth and uprightness of my heart, human frailties and unavoidable infirmities excepted, of which I bitterly complain every day. There was a petition, like I said, of a bunch of her friends and family concerning Miss Bradbury's life and conversation. We, the subscribers, do testify that it was such as become the gospel. She was a lover of the ministry in all appearance and a diligent attender upon God's holy ordinances, being of a courteous and peaceful disposition and caring. Neither did any of us, some of whom have lived in the town with her above 50 years, ever have or know that she ever had any different of falling out with any of her neighbors, man, woman, or child, but was always ready and willing to die for them, without laying her powers day and night, though with hazard to her health or other danger. More might be spoken, her condemnation, but this for the present. So it sounds like they're testifying for her. So According to her husband's testimony, which I'm going to read here in a bit, it seems like she wasn't really able to speak for herself, and maybe that was reason why they were of her. There's not really much about why she was being accused. Now, this is what her husband said. Concerning my beloved wife, Mary Bradbury, this is that I have to say. We have been married 55 years, and she hath been loving and faithful wife to me. Unto this day she hath been wonderful, laborious, diligent, and industrious in her place and employment, about the bringing up of our family, which have been 11 children of ours and 5 grandchildren. She was both prudent and provident, of a cheerful spirit and charitable. She being now very aged and weak, and grieved under her affliction, may her life and conversation have been such amongst her neighbors as gives a better and more real testimony of her than can be expressed by words owned by me. So it seems like my family, when it comes to this part, they testified on behalf of the accused, which is a deep contrast to what we saw earlier. And there are a lot of names of her neighbors and her friends. And as I scroll on here, I see Jarvis Ring and Hannah Fowler. Or, I'm sorry, Jarvis Ring and Hannah Ring, because they were married, but she was Hannah Fowler. Very interesting. A little bit more about Mary Bradbury. She was tried and convicted, regardless of all the testimonies, and sentenced to hang as a witch in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. However, she managed to evade sentence until the trials had been discredited, and she died in 1700 at age 85. So, good for her. Another little bit of history. What were the legal procedures of these trials? Okay. So after someone concluded that a loss, illness, or death had been caused by witchcraft, the accuser entered a complaint against the alleged witch with the local magistrate. If the complaint was deemed credible, the magistrates had the person arrested and brought in for a public examination, essentially an interrogation where the magistrates pressed the accused to confess. If the magistrates at this local level were satisfied that the complaint was well-founded, the prisoner was handed over to be dealt with by a superior court. In 1692, the magistrates often opted to wait for the arrival of the new charter and governor, who would establish a court of over-interminer to handle these cases. The next step at the superior court level was to summon witnesses before a grand jury. A person could be indicted on charges of afflicting with witchcraft or for making an unlawful covenant with the devil. Once indicted, the defendant went to trial, sometimes on the same day. So that's kind of how the legal procedures happened. So they had a process in place, but it still did not protect the person accused. Let's talk about the theories behind this and some of the things I mentioned earlier that kind of plays into what these could be. So, the cause of these symptoms of those who claimed to be afflicted continues to be very interesting. There has been various medical and psychological explanations for the observed symptoms. This has been explored by researchers, including psychological hysteria in response to Indian attacks, convulsive erotism caused by eating rye bread made from grain and infected by the fungus Claviceps purpura, which was a natural substance from which LSD is derived, so that could explain hallucinations. An epidemic of bird-borne encephalitis, lethargica, and sleep paralysis. Sounds like my ancestor. To explain the nocturnal attacks alleged by some of the accusers. Some modern historians are less inclined to focus on the biological explanations, preferring instead to explore motivations such as jealousy, spite, and the need for attention to explain the behavior. But, to some extent, I do think that some of these other things could explain why the Salem Witch Trials happened. Because, in the case of the epidemic, I guess, the initial question was, what happened at first? With those 2 girls that this whole thing derives from. Now, one theory is conversion disorder, and this is such a very interesting mental condition. I actually learned about this in class, and I never ever heard about it. What happens is that the sufferer experiences neurological symptoms, and that usually is caused by psychological conflict. Conversion disorder is also collectively known as mass hysteria. And there are many different types of conversion disorders, or there's like an umbrella that conversion disorder is under. So, conversion disorder, another way to explain it, is a condition in which you have physical symptoms of a health problem, but no injury or illness to explain them. So, for example, imagine if you are riding your bike and then you take a hard fall and then you're not able to move your arm. But your arm isn't injured, neither is any other part of your body. You go in for x-rays, they try to move your arm, but you're not able to. Pretty much what happens is your body converted the emotional and psychological stress of the bike fall into the physical response of a paralyzed arm. So it might seem really strange, but your symptoms are real and you can't control them. And experts, they do conclude that conversion disorder, it's a wider category of medical conditions called functional neurological disorders. There are other things in this category or under that functional disorders, but conversion disorder causes, they do think that it happens as a pathway for your brain to deal with emotional stress. And it's almost always triggered by upsetting situations and other mental disorders. Women are more likely to have it than men. Yay, another point for men. And it also happens more often in people who have a history of emotional stress or who have a hard time talking about their feelings. Ooh, sounds like me. Oof, ooh. So physical symptoms can sometimes help with an internal conflict. So for example, if you're struggling with the desire to hurt someone, conversion disorder may cause you to become paralyzed, making it impossible to act on that desire. So conversion disorder usually comes on suddenly and they look like problems with your nervous system. So like your brain, spinal cord, or other nerves. So typically there are movements that you can't control, tunnel vision or blindness, loss of smell or speech, numbness, or paralysis. And there have been cases where there have been people that have had some type of trauma. So there was a case in my book, in one of my classes that I read, and I can't for the life of me remember the full details, but I know that there's a man who experienced a trauma. I don't know if it was like a car accident or the loss of a loved one, but they undergone some type of emotional distress, and then they were paralyzed from the waist down. They became a paraplegic. There's no explanation for this because when they did x-rays and examinations, there was literally nothing wrong with his spinal cord. There is no indication that he was disabled. And once he started doing therapy, he actually became better and he was able to walk again at some point in his life. Very crazy. Now, what can be very troubling about conversion disorder is that some people, or some doctors, they could at first mistaken this for factitious disorder or Munchausen's syndrome. However, it's really hard to tell someone to get up and walk and they're paralyzed. Even though there's no proof of it, they still have that condition. And you can't really fake paralysis. I mean, you can put someone in a wheelchair and stuff like that, but if a doctor examines you and does like the knee test, you know, when they take like an instrument and they tap in between the joints of your knee and then your body reacts like your leg kicks up, you know how they always do that? They would do that and the person wouldn't respond. But then when they would do examinations and x-rays, there would be no proof of like something happening to their spinal cord to cause them to be paralyzed. So that's kind of how they can confirm that this is a conversion disorder versus a factitious one. Conversion disorder can collectively be known as mass hysteria. So if like a lot of people in the same area have kind of the same symptoms, they could be concluded as such. And medical sociologist Dr. Robert Bartholomew states in an article on Boston.com that the Salem Witch Trials were undoubtedly a cause of conversion disorder, during which, quote, psychological conflict and distress are converted into aches and pains that have no physical origin. Bartholomew believes that what happened in Salem was most likely an example of a motor-based hysteria. And that is one of the two main forms of conversion disorder. Professor Emerson W. Baker also suggests that conversion disorder is a possibility. He wrote a book called Hysteria of Witchcraft, and this is what he said in that. Conversion disorder, one of several psychological conditions that Abigail Hobbs and other afflicted people might have suffered from in 1692, shows heightened awareness of one's surroundings. Remember, Abigail Hobbs was one of the original 4 little girls that started to have fits and whatnot, and everyone thought that it was witchcraft because there was no explanation once they went to a doctor. Scholars have long noted the connectedness between the witchcraft outbreak and the King William's War, which raged on Massachusetts' northern frontier and was responsible for the war hysteria that seems to have been present in Salem Village and throughout Essex County. This was probably also another war that my ancestor Joseph Ring fought, because he did fight in a lot of wars. Baker, he does go on to explain that many of the afflicted girls, such as Abigail Hobbs, Mercy Lewis, Susanna Sheldon, and Sarah Churchwell, they were all war refugees who had previously lived in Maine, and they've been personally affected by the war to the point where some of them may have been experiencing post-traumatic stress. So he also says, they're not faking it. They don't know what's going on, and if it happens to people, they're terrified that it's even happening. And from there, step from affliction to accusation was a short one. And furthermore, he writes in his book that while societal scapegoats have evolved over time, he writes in 1692, the omnipresent threat was witchcraft. And those identified in Salem were either marginalized members of the community or enemies of the powerful families leading the witch hunt. And what is crazy is that Sigmund Freud, who is a very, very famous psychologist, he's the one who actually first named conversion disorder, and otherwise can be known as mass hysteria depending on what you look at. And it's still kind of a controversial diagnosis today. And back then, 300 years ago in the past, without the right person right in front of you, it's very hard to make that diagnosis. So it's very possible that a combination of psychological elements played into the girls' odd behavior that were afflicted. So while the mechanism of conversion disorder is very poorly understood, even to this day, there's no question that it happens. There have been a lot of cases that do result into this disorder. Even though it is very rare in the Western world, it still happens. If you have long-term stress, we've already talked about that a little bit, it can result in disruptions to the nerves and neurons that send messages to the muscles in the brain. So your body can go into haywire, twitching, shaking, facial tics, garbled speech, trance state. So even just the cause of long-term stress can change your biological makeup, and you can start experiencing some of the symptoms that they were having back in that time. And instead of knowing that it's a psychological cause, they would just automatically say that it was witchcraft. So now the interesting thing about it is today mass conversion tends to be most common in teenagers, and overwhelmingly teenage girls. This is another quote from Baker. And he said it tends to start out at the top of the social order. And you have to remember that Paris's daughter and his niece, they were the ones that first began showing symptoms. And then the next 2 girls to become afflicted by the fits were the niece of the town's doctor and the daughter of the wealthiest man in town. And perhaps the most infamous modern case of suspected conversion disorder occurred in 2012 in the upstate New York town of Leroy, in which a group of high school girls, they suffered from uncontrollable spasms and twitching. The fits began with a group of cheerleaders before spreading to a, quote, wider swath of the Leroy High School hierarchy. This was reported by the New York Times. Now, Baker described the symptoms displayed by the girls there also in his book. And he said their symptoms ranged from subtle twitches to violent jerking of body parts and verbal outbursts. One girl woke up from a nap to find her chin was jutting forward uncontrollably and her face was contracting into spasms. She was still twitching several weeks later when her friend awoke from a nap stuttering and then later started twitching, her arms flailing and head jerking. Though beginning with one group of friends, the numbers of the afflicted rapidly grew outward. Soon there were 12, next 16, then 18 suffering. Even one teenage boy and a 36-year-old woman showed symptoms of distress. There are other reported cases in the United States, dating back to the 1950s, that also disproportionately affected high school cheerleaders. And according to the Times, many of the afflicted girls in Leroy had difficult or stressful home lives, from absent or estranged parents to teenage pregnancy to poverty. So the infamy of the town received in the episode resulted in residents feeling even more isolated, with neighboring high schools canceling basketball games and concerns about plummeting business and real estate value. There's a hallucination theory which talks about ergot poisoning. So in 1976, in an article in the scientific journal Science, Linda R. Corpel proposed that ergot may have caused the symptoms that the afflicted girls and other accusers suffered from. Ergot is a fungus that infects rye and other cereal grains and contains a byproduct known as ergotamine, which is related to LSD. It causes the same symptoms as LSD. Ingesting ergotane is known to cause a number of cardiovascular and or neurological effects, such as convulsions, vomiting, crawling sensations on the skin, hallucinations, gangrene, etc. Ergot, it does tend to grow in warm, damp weather, and those conditions were present in 1691 growing season. In the fall, the infected rye would have been harvested and used to bake bread among the winter months, which is when the afflicted girl's symptoms began. Another theory is cold weather. I'm not so sure about this one, but let's talk about it. Historical records indicate that witch hunts occur more frequently during cold periods. This theory states that the most active era of witchcraft trials in Europe coincide with a 400-year-long cold period known as the Little Ice Age. In her paper, Auster explains that as the climate varied from year to year, during this cold period, the higher numbers of witchcraft accusations occurred during the coldest temperatures. That is very, very interesting. What is your theory? What do you think happened? And more importantly, why did my family participate? Especially in the accusations of Susanna Martin. I am your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you've been listening to What the Psychology. Stay psyched, y'all!